In today's day and age, four-cylinder engines are everywhere, especially turbocharged four-cylinder engines around 2 liters. And even three-cylinder engines are now becoming more ubiquitous within many vehicles. And that's because of increased fuel economy and emission standards, coupled with the fact that automakers are able to get pretty good power out of these 3- and 4-cylinder engines. Even pickup trucks today are using 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder engines when compared with previous years in which you pretty much got a V6 as a standard engine or a V8 as optional equipment in most pickups. And while they generally tend to perform well, there's just something missing from new vehicles that the old vehicles certainly had, and that is the sights and the sounds of the engines and transmissions from back in the day. Let's face it, no 3-cylinder or 4-cylinder engine on the marketplace sounds nearly as good as a big block or even a small block V8 engine from the 1960s revving to the Redline. And the great thing about the 1960s era engines and transmissions was that there were so many different ones that all had different power characteristics as well as different sounds. General Motors, for instance, prior to the 1976 model year, had each division produce V8s that, while maybe similarly or even identically sized, were completely different in terms of their engineering and only shared a few components between them, like ignition as well as fuel components like carburetors. But there were many different V8s. For example, a Chevrolet V8 was different from a Pontiac V8, different from an Oldsmobile, different from a Buick, different from a Cadillac V8. Then over at Ford, while Ford tended to use the same engines across the lineup by the 1960s, they did in some cases have different sizes. The Lincoln 460, as an example, wasn't exclusive until partway through the 1972 model year, when the 460 was offered as an option in the Mercury lineup, and then in 1973, the 460 was also offered in Fords. Chrysler had a bit of a similar story by that point as well, with the 440 as an example being an engine that could be optioned up in a Plymouth, a Dodge, or a Chrysler by that point in the 1960s. Of course, if you go back further, Ford had in the 1950s era its MEL series V8, the Mercury Edsel Lincoln V8, which was different from the FE V8, the Ford Edsel V8. So depending upon which model that you got in the Ford lineup, you could potentially get a different engine. And Chrysler had something similar, where the Hemis from the 1950s were different between divisions, and they were engineered differently and had different specifications as well. But one thing's for sure, no matter which of these V8 engines that you pick from the 50s, 60s, or 70s, they generally tend to have a really, really nice sound, especially if you magnify that with the appropriate exhaust systems. Now, over on the GM side of the house, there were a couple different components of the V8 engines that gave them a super, super sound, chief of which was the Quadrajet carburetor that was introduced partway through the 1965 model year on Chevrolet 396 engines, but soon proliferated across many different V8 engines, and it was used by GM all the way up until 1990 on the Olds 307 engine. The Quadrajets were outfitted on many of the big block engines, and they had a characteristic moan, as people like to call it, when you were accelerating and the supersized secondaries would open. The Quadrajet was one of the first spread-bore carburetors, meaning that the primaries were relatively small in order to promote good air-to-fuel mixing and great economy, but then when you stepped on the accelerator pedal, the secondaries would open and they were considerably larger. Up until this point, most 4-barrel carburetors had about equal-sized primary and secondary venturis, but the Quadrajet was one of the first mainstream carburetors to really take the spread-bore design when it came to a 4-barrel and use it not only to make great economy, but really great sounds. As I mentioned, people often talk about the Quadrajet moan. Let's listen to a couple engines with that beautiful Quadrajet moan sound and see if this evokes any memories for you as you drove one of your vehicles back in the day. Well, there's a few examples for you of some classic General Motors V8s revving their hearts out. And boy, don't they sound great? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know what your favorite GM V8 is from back in the day. Now, over at the Blue Oval, their engines also made some fine noises, but they didn't quite have that characteristic moan that the Quadrajet-equipped vehicles had because Ford's Motorcraft carburetors weren't really much of a spreadbore design, and even when they were, like the Motorcraft 4350, they just, for whatever reason, didn't quite have the same moan, perhaps because the carburetors didn't flow the same amount of air into them as the Quadrajet did. But that aside, Ford's engines definitely made some pretty noises. Let's take a listen to a few of these Ford V8s screaming. Now, over at Chrysler, there was also a great moaning that often came under hood, particularly on Chrysler engines that were equipped with the Carter thermoquad carburetor that you see here. The thermoquad was an interesting carburetor in that it used a plastic float bowl. You can see that black plastic area. And the idea there was that it was supposed to help insulate the fuel and dissipate heat more readily so that you didn't get vapor lock or other related issues. In practice, it worked, well, I'll say decently well. If you had a mechanic that didn't know what he or she was doing and they cranked down too tightly on some of the fasteners, and that plastic bowl would warp, and that wouldn't be that good. Or sometimes they just warp due to age. But in general, the thermoquads are pretty good carburetors. And when they were put on Chrysler engines in the 1970s, they gave them just a great noise similar to the Rochester Quadrajet. Let's take a listen here at a New Yorker 440 accelerating with the thermoquad on top of it. Note, this speedometer is in kilometers per hour. It's a Canadian car built in 1978, so don't think that it's all that fast, but it certainly sounds good. Well, I hope you enjoyed that segment. What's your favorite V8 sound from back in the day? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Let me know why it was your favorite. In any case, until next time, thanks again for watching this video and take care.